Welcome to Metrics That Matter. We will learn how to make sense of your fundraising data to make better decisions and raise more money with less effort. Brought to you by fundraisingreportcard.com, a simple and free analytics and reporting tool for nonprofit pros. Now measuring is easier than ever with fundraisingreportcard.com. Welcome to Metrics That Matter. I'm Tim Chen, host of the show. On this episode of Metrics That Matter, we'll be deep diving into donor acquisition costs. Make sure to follow along in the Metrics That Matter ebook found for free at fundraisingreportcard.com/book. With that, let's get to this episode of Metrics That Matter.
How's it going?
We shouldn't record on Fridays, Tim.
End of the long week. It's best time when people can hear us at our most
data-driven, at our most data-driven.
Yeah.
Friday, post-coffee. Mm-hmm. Someone brought in donuts to the office today. All I can think about is data right now.
Sure. Can't think about anything else.
If my girlfriend listens to this, please know I'm also thinking about you, not just data. Oh, there it is. Okay, come on. Let's dive into some stuff. Let's go.
So today is donor acquisition cost day.
We should have done this on like Pi Day or something.
Acquisition cost day. Yeah, we could say we recorded this on Pi Day, but we don't want to lie to people.
All right. Yeah.
Anyway, today is sometime in March. We'll just say that.
But yes, we're going to talk about donor acquisition costs. A big, important, incredibly challenging, but again, important concept when it comes to developing a data-driven nonprofit.
Yep. And there's going to be two resources that I'm going to mention later in the little break in this episode to check those out. They'll also be in the show notes where you can get those as well. Little cheat sheets for different things that we're going to talk about here.
Yep.
So the first thing I want to dive into is just remind us all what donor acquisition cost is. We've gone over it a couple times, but just a quick reminder for those that may have forgotten.
Yep. Yeah. So donor acquisition costs is going to be our measurement of the expense we have to, put out there, our investment to acquire and bring a new donor to our organization. So this has its roots in the for-profit space. Our firm here, we strive to calculate customer acquisition cost. The idea is, how much does it cost to bring someone new to the organization? And once you have that information, which we're going to talk about some of the different techniques to get there, breaking that down by, acquisition channel and things like that. Once you have that, you start to at least get the potential to measure the profitability of that engagement, because once you have that baseline, okay, it costs us $100 to bring donors from Facebook to the organization, you can start to think about, well, what is the lifetime value of their giving to the organization, come up with these measures of profitability. So donor acquisition cost is this kind of like really important building block metric, but it's also really challenging to measure and to calculate.
And one of the challenges is expenses. What are all expenses? What does that mean?
Yeah, so different organizations will define this differently. Do you include overhead costs when considering expenses? And I hate to call it overhead costs, but that's, from an outside perspective, that's what it is. So do you just include expenses related to a particular channel or to a particular event that you're acquiring donors through? Or do you also include in that the rent that you pay for the building that you're in, for your offices? These are kind of, the discussions that inside organizations that are calculating acquisition costs, inside firms like MarketSmart, where we are, that we have to discuss, because you have to all be on the same page, because you cannot have, one measure of donor acquisition cost in fiscal 16 and then a wildly different measure of donor acquisition cost in fiscal 17, one including rent, one not including rent, one including salaried employees, one not including salaried employees, and expect to have meaningful discussion and realizations from that.
If you're doing it based off a campaign, are you calculating the employee of 1/10 of their time was devoted towards that, so we're going to do that? Or it gets complicated.
You can start to see how this becomes a challenging metric to measure, not because it's too wildly complex. I think on the surface, most everyone gets it. How much do we spend to acquire a donor? We're not necessarily talking about how much did you spend to acquire a donor and then steward them throughout your organization for 18 years. Like that would be challenging in its own right to measure. Like how do we attribute, expenses towards stewardship? We're not even talking about that. We're simply talking about what I think most people grasp is someone new came to our organization. How much did we spend to get that? Really qualifying and quantifying what it means to spend money to bring someone is the really challenging part. that has to stem from internal discussion. My experience is being able to partner with organizations is that really everyone does it differently, and that's A-okay as long as it's consistent. Because once it's consistent, you can start to measure variance. As long as we're measuring something the same way, if you're trying to lose 10 pounds and your scale's off by 5 pounds every single day, it doesn't really matter if you weigh in at, 200 pounds or 190 pounds on the first day.
As long as it's off by the same 5 pounds.
Exactly. As long as you still hit 180 or 190, that 10-pound decrease, who cares?
Yeah.
You hit your goal. So at least in a similar vein here with donor acquisition cost. If you're calculating acquisition cost and it looks incredibly high because you're including all salaried employees, you're including, rent, you're including your direct mail vendor costs, you're including everything, and it looks like it costs you $1,000 to acquire a new donor, that's fine. Mm-hmm. As long as you're measuring it the same next year and the year following and things like that.
Yeah.
Because you'll start to see variance in what you're doing. And that's what we aspire to have here.
Okay. Yeah, and a quick plug to overheadmyth.com and nonprofitaccountingbasics.org. They've got some good ideas of what fundraising expenses can be and some ideas that you mentioned in the book here. So some things you might want to include in your expenses: direct mail expenses, which includes copywriting, design, mail handling, the actual printing, postage, advertising, like maintaining donor records. It includes just like any services that you have, like a CRM system you're probably paying for, the actual event costs, preparing materials. Like it's like there's a lot of stuff like email. Like how do you send your email? Are you paying MailChimp?
All of these become expenses, and you can think about breaking it down by particular channel, or let's stick with the event, motif or theme for a moment. Let's say your organization is event heavy and it's fundraising. You've got 2 key events each year. Essentially what you would do is all the kind of marketing expenses leading up to that event would be associated in your donor acquisition cost calculation. The expense for sending out a direct mail solicitation to remind people, or piece to remind people to come to the event. Staffing the event would be an expense. The renting of the space would be an expense. I was recently working with a consultant who was telling me a story about a really large organization in New York, and their entire fundraising pre-recession was all events-based. And what they would do is they would rent out the ballrooms in these fantastic New York hotels, really luxurious hotels. They get a corporate sponsor, and then they would bring in people from different industries and give awards and talk about philanthropy and things like that. And it would cost them like $750,000 to put on this event. Okay. And they'd raise, like $1.5 million, or $1.25 million. The donor acquisition cost there would be that $750,000 that they spent, renting out this luxurious ballroom, getting all the food, getting all the staff involved in that. It's all those expenses that go into it. And then it's that immediate return on investment looking at, the dollars that are brought in. And then I know we're going to go into this next week thinking about the lifetime value of that relationship as well. But those are all the expenses. And those are the ideas when we're thinking about donor acquisition cost. So if you have 2 events during the year, the different expenses for each one would be counted independently, and the donors that are acquired through those 2 distinctly different events, the total count would be taken in association with the total expenses for that particular event. That would be what gives you that individual, donor by donor, quote unquote, acquisition cost.
Now let's dive a bit more into strategies and your approach for doing this. One thing you mentioned in the book is small nonprofits versus big nonprofits, and the approach being a bit different based on that.
When you think about incorporating overhead expenses into your calculation, there has to be some consideration for the amount of staff or the amount of people that are involved. And also bear in mind the kind of level of responsibilities and the roles and responsibilities you take on at different size organizations. When you're at a smaller shop, it might not necessarily make sense to incorporate all of your overhead costs, whereas when you're at a larger organization that's got 50 employees, they've got staff that are researchers and data scientists and this and that and that. I mean, incorporating those overhead costs kind of does make sense because you've got all these resources at your disposal. They do need to count towards something when considering the donors that are being brought into the organization, the funders that are being brought in. But when you're at a smaller organization, it can like really drastically skew what you're looking at in terms of acquisition expenses. And it's also not necessarily 100% fair because as a 1 or 2 or even 3 person shop, you're kind of doing a little bit of everything. It's not like you could really, fairly distribute your time associated allocated to a particular channel or to a particular event. When you have more resources, you're able to get a little more scientific and a little more granular here. And also, since we're talking about larger amounts of money, if you've got a staff of 50 people, you're talking about millions of dollars in salaried expenses versus maybe 100,000 or a little bit more than 100,000 at a small shop. The magnitude just goes up a little bit as well.
With bigger nonprofits, you may have a single person dedicated to that one event versus one person working on
6 events.
Yeah.
Which also, even though we're at a larger organization, so more bureaucracy, more process, more systems, it actually can be easier to start to calculate donor acquisition costs because just Jane worked on the event all year. Great. So attribute her salary and her expenses to the event. Great, done. It's way more complicated and convoluted when you're a small shop and, you work on everything. Primary responsibility might not even be fundraising. You might be listening to this thinking about the program benefits that your organization puts out, but you just get pulled into doing the fundraising piece. You get pulled into doing the event. So keeping your salaried expense out of that, donor acquisition cost probably makes sense.
This week, I've got 2 free resources that will come in handy. The first resource to download is the Ultimate Donor Acquisition Cost Cheat Sheet, which you can download for free at fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC sheet. That's www.fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC sheet. The cheat sheet is a handy reference guide that you can use to be reminded of what donor acquisition cost is, how it can be useful, how to interpret the data, what costs to include, and how to balance your DAC with lifetime value. Download it now at www.fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC sheet. The second resource available for you is an Excel template that you can use to calculate your donor acquisition costs, which you can download right now at fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC template. That's www.fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC template. This is an Excel template that we'll be diving more in depth into at the end of this episode. With that, let's get back to my conversation with Zach about donor acquisition costs.
So you get the data, you have this data. How should you use this data? What decisions does this help you make?
Donor acquisition cost is going to give you that baseline. And essentially, it's going to tell you this is how much we've historically spent to bring in a new donor. And we'll dive deeper into the opposite end of the piece, the lifetime value.
Comparing those two is really valuable.
That's the strategy component. When we look at lifetime value and we say, okay, if I were to bring in a new under $100 donor, they would give to the organization $65. Great. Because now if your donor acquisition cost is greater than $65, it's probably not going to be a profitable engagement with that donor. But without diving too deep into lifetime value, the benefit or what you should be doing with donor acquisition costs is looking at it historically. Is the event that you've put on year after year after year, or the golf tournament or the gala that you've put on year after year after year, if you can go back and historically look at the number of acquired donors from each of those, get that measure of expense associated with each of those, divide, and figure out what is the total donor acquisition cost. I hate to sound too B2B, or too for-profit, but on a per lead basis, what did we spend to acquire that new donor? Looking historically, and again, it doesn't matter how you calculated it, let's look for variance. That could start to spark a little bit of a discussion internally about, why has our cost per lead gone up? Have we been acquiring less donors, or have we just been spending way more on the event and unfortunately not acquiring as many donors as we had anticipated? That can start to have some of that discussion. And if you have someone on your board who's got like a finance background, or someone on the fundraising committee who's like very into finance, this is the information that they're going to love, because it also alludes to a concept called cost per dollar raised. I don't think it's in the book even, but maybe over time we'll start talking about these are the types of metrics that they're like your profit and loss sheet. This is what that kind of CFO type of person is going to want to look at, discuss, and understand.
Yeah. And your vendors may get more expensive year to year as you put on events, and maybe you do track within an event what are the costs per each service you're needing to implement, and see where, if you need to shop around year to year based on that.
Donor acquisition costs and that per lead cost can start to highlight things like that. Either it's going to signal to you our expenses have gone up to host this event or to market through this channel. And that should spark the discussion of, well, why have our expenses gone up there? Like you're alluding to, could vendors be increasing their prices? Have we just been less judiciously spending our money? Or the other idea, if cost per lead is going up, is we're just acquiring less donors through that channel, through that event. And if that's the case, that's definitely worth discussing, because why are we still investing in it? Is it still a worthwhile dedication of resources, time, and money? That's what should happen here when you start to look at DAC.
Yeah, and this will really help combat gut feel decisions where, my gut, I really think people love the radio still and we should advertise there. But if the data is telling you...
Why are you taking shots at the radio, man? I love the radio.
I'm a podcaster. I love the radio. But instead, you should put your ad money in podcasts, because that's where everyone is listening.
I feel like now's the perfect time, because I love this when I drive into work and I hear the public radio, please donate to your local public... Yeah. Everyone, please donate to your local public radio. We don't work with NPR.
We don't. They're wonderful people, though.
They are wonderful. There you go, NPR. Now will you work with us? Is that how this works?
That's how it works, yeah.
I think so. What you're saying, Tim, is 100% right. You look at this donor acquisition cost, you look at it across these different channels. You're not benchmarking. You can, but I wouldn't recommend benchmarking yourself to peer organizations when it comes to donor acquisition cost, because again, it's not necessarily standardized across organizations. You benchmark against yourself historically, what's been going on. And that will spark a conversation that's incredibly worthwhile.
Awesome. So some key takeaways from this episode. First is there's a template you can download for Excel, and I'll talk about in a little break you would have heard by now at this point in this episode about where you can download that template for free. And it's an Excel template that's a nice first step to start tracking this stuff if you aren't already.
And I think it's worth mentioning, Tim, so donor acquisition cost is unfortunately one of the metrics we don't calculate within Fundraising Report Card. I don't know any like vendor or service or software that does calculate donor acquisition cost because of the complexities that we've discussed. We could create some software that does it, but then a lot of organizations are going to not include this expense or that expense. So unfortunately, we don't have something that's like super automated, but this Excel spreadsheet should be helpful. It's a template, it's a guideline, it's got the formulas in there so that you can see on a per donor basis, what did we spend? You're going to have to input the metrics in there. So you're going to have to look at your expenses and you're going to have to look at how many donors did we acquire. But once you have those input metrics, you toss them in the spreadsheet and it'll give you that output. You'll break it down by campaign, by channel, radio, gala, etc. Should be hopefully really useful.
Awesome. Then the other thing I just should mention here is some of your channels will have a rather long-term gain, such as like a donation page on your website. It may cost a lot up front, but serving you for a good 3 to 5 years or maybe longer, giving you return. So I'm not sure if there's any words on how to address that within this.
If your organization has an online donation form, which I'm sure it does, look at donor acquisition cost actually not necessarily through leads that come to that form, but if you can, if you're either working with a vendor or you're doing this internally, look at the source. Cost per lead from Facebook, cost per lead from Google if you're doing Google ads or something like that, or from YouTube if you've got YouTube content. That would be where I would look at your donor acquisition cost. What, from those different channels, is there a difference in cost per lead that we're driving them to that landing page, that offer, which is the donation form. So when you do have those long-term things like that, and you're going to want to measure this on an annual basis, that's where I see most organizations having success, because it is complicated and it is complex. Once a year, let's just take a peek. What was our donor acquisition cost through Facebook? What was our donor acquisition cost through this other digital media platform? Driving them to the same place, hopefully within, whatever system you're using to capture your online donations, you'll be able to have access to this information. So use it on kind of that type of annual cadence.
That's good. Any other key takeaways from this episode?
Look forward to next week, part 4 of our conversation here, because it's really when you start to pair donor acquisition cost with donor lifetime value that you begin this kind of feedback loop. It's a loop of understanding if we're profitable or not in our engagements. And it takes years to realize that, on the bottom line, because donors upgrade their giving, that takes time. Donors will lapse and leave the organization, that takes time. But knowing based off of your historical performance, if something we're about to do should make us money, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's as all businesses, all organizations, if they could have some certainty in their profitability, it's a win. So next week, we'll dive into the other piece of the puzzle here, and we should be able to build that loop, the other half of it at least, and make things feel a little more comprehensive.
Good.
Was that a good kind of hope for next week, Tim?
Yeah. Stay tuned.
Are you going to tune in?
I'm going to tune in. I'll be here. I'll be curious about what you say. And I'm excited. Yeah.
Good stuff. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Metrics That Matter. If you like this show, review it on Apple Podcasts and pass it along to a colleague. Make sure to download the DAC cheat sheet at www.fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC sheet and to download the Excel template to calculate your donor acquisition costs by going to fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC template. That's fundraisingreportcard.com/DAC template. Thanks again for listening to Metrics That Matter.